Okay, this video is on hydraulic lifters, so as to give you some supplement information when you begin the inspection and performing the procedures that go along with your hydraulic lifters and during the overhaul process. The 0320 has a couple of different styles of lifters in them. And so the original 0320s, the ones that they had the most of, was where you had a cam follower that, of course, you got your cam here that runs around and smoothly pushes this thing up and down, to open and close our valves on the valve train. This was a kind of an area of problem, especially since in building our air oils, the EPA came along and mandated the removal of, I believe it was the zinc, which the material called ZDP, which was an extra lubricant to the oil to help with this high stressed area inside of an engine. It's even been a problem in the automotive world quite a bit with guys overhauling the old style V8s and getting this to break in. What would happen on these things, you can see this one here, I get the light just right. You can see how it looks like the surface of the moon. And so that's what would happen, especially if the engine sat around and got a little rust or the braking would go bad, something like that. And then you end up rounding off your cam lobe. You'll see how the bump on this one's getting kind of flat looking compared to the others that you have going on there. So this is the cam follower that's there. And then the hydraulic lifter lives inside of that cam follower. And so this is the guy here that if there's any clearance in the valve train, hopefully in that should be in that 28 to 80,000 specified range, then this hydraulic lifter inside of here would pump up with oil and then maintain that zero clearance on the valve train. So as I mentioned in the last video or a previous video, what is the clearance, the operating, and the engine warmed up properly and everything's where it's supposed to be, what is the operating clearance in the valve train? Zero. So these things also sometimes are called zero lash indicating clearance. These are a zero lash lifter system that's in here. Another style you'll be working on when they came out with the 0320 H2AD, where they would look like this. Now, when I show you the principle of operation, it's going to be all the same. It's just that this is more of an automotive-looking one. In fact, Mr. Potter had brought in some of his out of his Mustang, and they're identical to the ones that are in the H2AD, so I think they probably just used a Ford lifter inside those H2ADs. But, yeah, so there's down inside of this thing, there is a spring that's in here. Then you've got the actual lifter itself with the little ball that's inside. I don't know if I can get that in the picture. You'll see a little check ball down. You'll see it on the other picture in a second when I show it to you. And as I'm sliding this back together, showing you the parts of this, one thing you never want to do, you don't want to get safety wire, because I need to touch that ball so that lifter body piece, or the little piston in there, will drop down, but there's an air gap, and especially and we are taking these apart because we do need to completely get the oil out of them so that we can check that dry tappet clearance that we talked about, and I'll mention that again as well too in this video. But I don't want to use safety wire to touch that ball. What I recommend is like those little plastic straws that come off of some spray cans and stuff. I can reach in here, touch that ball, and then that lifter just fell down inside there. To get that out of there, out in the shop, what I recommend is using a ball gauge. The ball gauge reaches down in there, and then you kind of apply a little pressure. You'll hear kind of, when it's got oil in it, you'll hear it kind of go, kind of a sucky, like a boot stuck in the mud kind of a thing as it comes apart. But you can kind of see how it's sitting right up there. You can see it's not going down all the way, but then I touch the little ball, and then there it goes. Then on top of that is the little cup sits on here, and that, of course, is what your push rod is sitting down onto. So that kind of connects the whole assembly. Now let's review very quickly up here on our picture where we've got the push rod here, goes down to our rocker arm here, but you've got your cam follower. You just looked at, there's your cam there in the center. You got the cam follower, or it could be just that lifter sitting on there on the automotive style that we have in the 0320 H2AD. But that, of course, is where that lives in there. And then we, of course, talked about where we're taking this apart. You know, we're doing all the inspection that goes along with it, but you're getting all the oil out of this so that you can come down here, squeeze on the rocker arm to check that dry tappet clearance that you have down there between the valve stem tip and the toe of the rocker arm there, ensuring we've got the proper 28 to 80 thousandths of clearance. Before I get you set that down there, I am going to be attaching into the Canvas page a nice little page of notes here that lists some of the stuff, you know, where the hydraulic lifter is a zero lash lifter. There's also a service instruction that we're going to be looking at to be checking these things for wear, you know, inspecting where it rides on the cam, and some checks of the hydraulic lifter, how you're supposed to check it, make sure it's not losing air, and some things like that. And that's in Lycoming Service Instruction 1011, and whatever the latest version of that, you know, as they get later, up goes the alphabet. Then there's a little diagram that talks about all the parts and pieces of the lifter itself. Anyway, so I'll be attaching that page into the Canvas, so you'll have that for your notes as well too, besides this video introducing this to you. Okay, let's talk a little bit about how that lifter does work inside the engine. So we're going to turn on a big picture here. And let me take a second to orientate you, make sure you're seeing the right stuff here in this picture. Yeah, I think so. Let me slide you over just a little bit more. I think that's pretty much got it. I think we're still missing there's our push rod end. Yeah, that's probably enough to get us going down here. I think it might be just out of the picture, but down here is the cam, and that, of course, is shoving on this whole tappet body, or the whole, you know, cam follower or tappet body, a couple common names with that. But again, here's the hydraulic lifter living inside of that cam follower. So that was this little plunger piece that we were looking at a second ago. That guy there is this guy right up inside of here. So, of course, what happens with this whole thing, when that cam comes around and shoves this whole assembly this way, we, of course, got the push rod that's sitting here in the little lifter cup, just like I had on that other lifter. And, of course, that shoves that whole rocker arm assembly up top, opening the valve. Then what happens when the cam goes to the non-bump side, you know, around to the flat side, allowing the whole valve train to relax a little bit. While it's in the relaxed position, up here's our main oil gallery, which has, you know, a constant 60 psi of oil pressure that's pushing on this, coming down here. And so if any clearance tries to develop in here, which it should, you know, because that operating clearance was at 28 to 80 thousandths, so somewhere in that range. So when that clearance opens up in there, that oil pushes in here, off-seats the little ball, and fills this area, maintaining that zero clearance that we're after, or that zero lash lifter system that we're looking at there. Then, coming back around again, when the cam comes up and starts to shove this whole thing, there's a certain amount of oil, while the valve has been opened, then there's a certain amount of oil that squeezes by here, comes up here, comes up through that lifter cup, and right up through the center of the push rod. So as the engine is operating, oil is coming up the push rod and then squirting out up at the top of the rocker arm, providing lubrication to those valve rocker parts and bushings and stuff up on the top part of the cylinder. So if you were to have the rocker box cover off of this engine watching it operating, you would see little pulsations of oil coming out of there. Every time the cam comes around and shoves it, there's a certain amount of bleed that goes on and pushing that oil up when it's at its normal operating temperature and lubricating the overhead. The V8, we're talking about overhauling one of those. you let it go too long. They actually sell little for adjusting the valve train on a V8. Where they got little plates that go on all the rocker arms. So otherwise, that oil squirts all the way out like a clam on the beach, and starts squirting oil on your exhaust system. Then you got smoke everywhere and whatever. So fortunately, we don't have to do that on the aircraft. Once we got our dry tappet clearance adjusted, then it should be correct. We don't have to worry about adjusting the valve train later with the rocker box covers off. So, because we do a dry tappet clearance. Automotive, those lifters, you would be completely filling them up with oil, just the opposite, and then a little bit different procedure. But since we're learning aircraft here, we'll just stick with that. Okay. Now, another thing I wanted to talk a little bit about, why the hydraulic lifter, and let me spin you back around here again. Back over to this guy. Fortunately, I got a light on right in the center of our guy. See if we can't slide him over a little bit. Get him out of the light there. That might be a little bit better. Let me check that. Yeah, that's a little bit better. Now, one reason that the hydraulic lifter is beneficial is because our aircraft engine is got the aluminum heads. We've got quite a bit of expansion coefficient going on. So we've got several test questions we're going to be dealing with. An example would be, what is going to happen to my valve timing? In other words, so in consideration to my valves opening and closing, talking about those events. So we go back, think about that again, where we talked about where the intake valve opens on the end of the exhaust stroke, is open the full duration of the intake stroke, but then finally gets around to closing about 45 degrees after bottom center. Well, as the engine warms up and we have that lifter squeezing down, even though the valve might be supposed to be at a full open position, even though that cam is at its highest point, because the lifter starts to bleed, the valve might actually start heading back towards the seat a little bit. So you'll see on valve duration charts and stuff that there's the theoretical, if it was perfect, if this was a solid lifter in here, and that's why they like to use solid lifters in automotive, so we don't have to deal with that, where we're trying to keep that valve open as long as we can, but yet we got a hydraulic lifter that's trying to close it. But where it's beneficial on our aircraft engine is because as this engine is heating up, I'm having to deal with cylinder elongation. And so back to that test question, when what's going to happen to my valve timing as my engine is warming up and cylinder elongation is taking place? Well, if I take a look, pretending this is a solid lifter that's sitting here, as this engine warms up and these 2 points grow outward, that's going to open up that gap between the toe of the rocker arm and the valve stem tip. So then what's going to happen is as the cam assembly comes around, and I have to, because the cylinder is elongated and the push rod being made of steel does not expand at the same rate as this aluminum headed cylinder, so this grows outward and increasing that gap. So the cam comes around, starts to push on the assembly, but it's first got to eat up that gap in there before it finally comes in contact with the valve and starts to open it. So we say then, as cylinder elongation takes place, then my valves are going to open late and close early. Now that might be something you want to write down in your notes, something about 10 times. What happens to the valve timing as cylinder elongation is taking place and the engine is warming up? The valves will tend to open late and close early. And like I say, there's all sorts of renditions of that test question is asked a couple of different ways. While I'm thinking, I'm going to get back on one thing here. When we go to attempt to get these lifters and stuff out of the engine. Make sure, as I mentioned, we don't ever bring safety wire near those check balls, because that check ball can get damaged inside and cause problems. Where we use the plastic straw if we have to touch those check balls for any reason. But the other thing there's a real temptation to do when trying to slide these out of the cam down there in the engine, there's a real temptation to want to put a magnet, use some sort of fancy magnet to touch the lifter and help slide it out. That's a no-no. We don't want to get any kind of magnets near our hydraulic lifter system, and nor do we do any magnetic particle inspection of these things, because that magnetic in there can cause problems with a little check ball and cause some malfunctions with the operation of the valve train. Let me check my notes here real quick. Oh, one more thing I was going to mention. Because of that problem where the bottom of these things can have, with the lack of the really good oils anymore and issues there, Lycoming has moved to roller rocker system. So just like our older radial engines over the years, let me grab one of those real quick for you. Uh-oh. Not coming up with one. Well, I'll have to demonstrate that to you in the next video, but there's simply just they've got a roller mechanism that's here, so we don't have that tremendous pressure between the cam follower and the cam there. So like I say, Lycoming now is utilizing roller rockers. And you all see in the automotive world and the racing industry, in fact, Mr. Potter, that's why I have his lifters, is he installed roller rockers into his little Mustang's engine for his 1968 Shelby, I think is the year. Anyway, okay, so this should give you a little information. Like I said, I'll be working with that service instruction 1011G, inspecting the lifters, and then you will be taking the lifters apart and getting them completely dry on oil so that we can get an accurate dry tappet clearance check. And so we'll get those lifters all serviced, put them in some plastic bags, put them away, so later on during engine reassembly they're all ready to go and ready to be able to check that dry tappet clearance as we reassemble the engine. Okay, I think that should do it.